we felt that there was a lot of good work on leadership, but it tended to be narrow and focused. And so frameworks needed to be more comprehensive. It's not your traits.
Right.
Unless you translate those traits into
Right.
behaviors, they don't get conveyed.
I've come to believe that we evolved leadership and followership as one of the most fundamental forms of organization.
Have you ever said about another party, I just don't understand how they can see it that way, or I don't understand how they think?
Yeah.
Well, then they're not going to trust you.
That's right. Wherever there's a divide in a group, wherever there's a distinction, there's a potential for distrust.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to think of a greater distinction between human and machine.
The notion that if I'm leading you, I'm going to be way better if you're also leading me.
Exactly.
And that cycle, that positive cycle, means it's not hierarchical.
Right.
Welcome to the 6 Domains of Leadership podcast. I'm Sitkin. For decades, my work has focused on understanding what leaders actually do that makes a difference in their organizations, their communities, and the world. In this podcast, we explore leadership not as a title, but as a set of behaviors that shape trust, credibility, and impact. In each episode, I'm joined by leaders, scholars, and practitioners who are rethinking leadership and shaping a better tomorrow today. Thank you for being part of this conversation. In this episode, I will be engaging in conversation with my lifelong friend and co-creator of the 6 Domains of Leadership model and co-founder of Delta Leadership, Professor Allan Lind. Allan is a distinguished scholar in social psychology, procedural justice, leadership and organizational behavior, now retired from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. Together, we will explore how leadership has evolved since the development of the 6 Domains of Leadership model, examining what has changed, what remains timeless, and how leaders can adapt to a rapidly transforming world. Well, I'd like to welcome my old friend and colleague, Allan Lind, and we'll be talking, at least in the beginning, about the origins of the 6 Domains of Leadership model and how we see the world today evolving from where it was when we first started working on this 25 years ago. So to start off, to sort of kick off the discussion, when we first developed the model, what did you have in mind in terms of the individual leadership challenges, the organizational leadership challenges that we were trying to address that we felt really hadn't been addressed previously?
Gosh, it's a while ago. My memory is that when we started our discussions, we were motivated by the fact we thought we needed a different leadership approach at our school. And different in the sense that we wanted it to be, I think, more complete, B, more firmly grounded in surrounding disciplines, and see something that we could really get at that students, because we were talking mainly not about exec ed participants, but MBA students. We could get our students to appreciate as something that they could learn to do, something actionable. And it was natural in my mind for us to talk because on the one hand, our research areas were so close, and on the other hand, we had some complementarity, which I think was sort of behind your question about individual and organizational.
Yeah.
I was trained as a social psychologist, and you were trained in organizational issues, organizational studies more than I was. But we knew we were simpatico from previous conversations, and it just seemed a reasonable partnership to try and develop something.
Yeah, I think that's the way you framed it is I think really nice and clarifies for me some of it, that we felt that there was a lot of good work on leadership, but it tended to be narrow and focused, which as scientists
Yeah.
we're very comfortable
Yeah.
with, but in practice one doesn't have that luxury.
Right.
And so frameworks needed to be more comprehensive. We also felt that there were a lot of silos in different disciplines,
Right.
and some disciplines that had something to say about leadership were really being ignored because they were focused on the science, but not on the application to leadership quite as much. And then finally, that it had to be practical. That now I actually have a very vivid memory of how this all started with us, which was the dean of our school asked for proposals about an executive ed program.
Mhm.
And you came to my office and said, maybe the two of us should stop being such prima donnas and make fun of what we didn't think was up to standard. And instead, we should roll up our sleeves and take the risk of trying to do something to address the issues we were complaining about. And so what we did was we went to the broader social science literature on influence and said, who speaks in a rigorous scientific way about this in a way that's also practical? And that's how we started the venture.
I don't doubt it for a second. You know, I remember a lot of conversations at that time. Um, for me, I think part of the motivation to that call for proposals was that I had been teaching management a lot,
Mhm.
especially um, in our global MBA programs, and I would teach a segment on leadership, but I felt like there was so much more
Mhm.
that could be done, and the bits I taught, while nicely grounded in a particular conception of leadership or in science, were not. You always felt like there were more roads to go down,
Mhm.
and I guess what I remember most is the excitement when we got into it, and it began to fold out, as it were. It was as though we were opening up some folded, you know, like almost a like a puzzle that would
Yeah.
unfold, and we would see more and more of it, and excitement as we began to put
Yeah.
it together.
Yeah, and, also especially remember how gratifying it was that we didn't go in with a preconception about what we would come out with, and we ended up with these 6 buckets
Right.
of behavior
Right.
that had different effects,
Right.
and that emerged from our review of the
Right.
research. And we didn't start out looking at the leadership research. We started out looking at the social science research
Correct.
and then went to the leadership research as kind of a check
Right.
to see if we missed anything. And we did miss a few things,
And we
but
did.
not many.
Not many, not many. I think that, you know, as we pushed the question of leadership into our more more basic science roots, we began to see the connections and the applications of the basic science. You know, I think on your work on trust, it just seemed to me obvious. If you're going to talk about leadership, you have to talk about trust.
Right.
And
Well, and that relates to your work on fairness.
exactly. And
That's where we really connected
it was,
originally.
yes, and it was we had both been looking, I think, for a long time, as you said, this issue of influence, and
Mhm.
influence that was not coercive in any sense,
Mhm.
but sort of influence that is um, that is voluntary, that is persuasion, that is
Mhm.
moving people by the rightness of your ideas, and that just opened up door after door. And as you said, some of that, then we'd have to go and read other things and bring ourselves up to speed with other topics.
Mhm.
But in doing that, I think we it didn't feel at all forced. It was just the next logical step.
Well, it was because we were personally really curious
Right.
about understanding it better from a scientific point of
Precisely.
view, but also understanding it better in a way we could, in a practical way, communicate it to our MBA students and our executive
Right.
students and so
Right.
forth,
Right.
because it had real implications.
Yes, and I remember lots of discussions that we had about the early on, we arrived at the conclusion that leadership was fundamentally behavior, and that if you were going to teach leadership, you were teaching us skill sets, a number of skill sets in particular. So as we developed, I think, the science of it, we were always attentive for how could we teach this? How could we get people to understand not just that you should be fair, or or you should be trustworthy, but how do you do this? How specifically do you enact this? And as scientists, I think we also moved quite quickly to the problems of assessment. The problems of how do you how do we were aware that people are not always themselves aware of what they're doing, and how could we help them see that?
So, an interesting point that came up as we thought about that, and which people often point out as a really distinctive aspect of what we developed, is the emphasis on effects.
Yes.
That you need to engage in behaviors.
Right.
It's not your traits.
Right.
Unless you translate those traits into behaviors, they don't get conveyed. But then the question is, what effects are you trying to create as a leader that are distinct from the effects you might be trying to create as a manager?
Right. Yeah. And I remember the excitement when we began parsing things into the 6 domains. And I can remember drawing that on board after board, and going through various names for the domains. But then thinking about the effects of of leadership in each domain, and I think for both of us, the exciting kind of idea that we were not going to tell people just go be a good leader. We're going to give them almost a diagnosis and treatment sort of approach. What do you need? This is how you do it.
Yeah.
And then that fed, I think, into a renewed attention to giving people both very specific feedback about the quality of their leadership in each domain. And we developed the our first leadership study, and then our newer leadership study, our leadership survey, I mean. And it was and our development of various tools within each domain. So by the time, of course, in the background of this, we're teaching it, right? So after we got it, the idea fundamentally put together, we began teaching it with various missteps.
Right.
But I think we kept improving, and a good bit of the improvement was involved in giving people behavioral examples and giving them within each domain of leadership actually at least 2 tools to use. This is a tool you can use when you can use storytelling to improve your relational leadership, or you can use you can use the idea of how do you set high standards to improve your inspirational leadership, and then checking through the science of our surveys to see whether those things really helped. It was quite exciting for me, not just as a teaching exercise. So it's probably the most engaging and pleasant teaching I ever did was was with our leadership model, but also as a scientist.
Yeah.
To see these remarkable, for social science studies, remarkable relationships emerging between domains and effects,
Yeah, and part of that was so exciting for us, but also very meaningful for those we teach.
Indeed.
Is that it's great to say, oh, as a leader, you're exercising influence.
Yes.
Okay, so what do I do?
Yeah.
To be able to bring that down to clusters of behaviors. So if I really am having problems building a strong community, or I'm having problems getting people to be innovative or take initiative or whatever, what is it I do? And a lot of approaches would say, well, if you do everything right, that'll happen.
Everything back. Yeah.
That's not very helpful. And But for us to be able to bring it to say, no, here are 4 types of behaviors
Yes.
that will lead to that effect.
Yes.
You don't have to worry about a lot of other things are related, but
Yeah.
they're not directly
Right.
related. Um, and and then to bring it down to specific subdomains, we call
Yes.
them, and then behaviors, really could let people get a good, clear, crisp diagnosis and be able to take actions and say, for example, I'm never going to be good at that, but I'm really good at this other thing. Maybe I need to partner with someone who's going to be good
Well,
at that thing that's a weakness.
exactly.
And it allowed people to acknowledge weaknesses, but also to take certain kind of pride in strengths and then focus on how am I going to leverage that strength
Yep.
and fill in for that weakness.
Yep.
That was part of the excitement.
It was exciting for me to teach it.
Mhm.
It was exciting for me to work with coaches who were
Yep.
were getting that idea across, and it was quite exciting, I think, for the participants and students because, um, I'm sure, guys, as I have, you've gotten a lot of feedback over the years that, um, that this is something that people go away with, and
Yeah.
it continues to be useful for them.
You mean I still hear from people we had as
Yeah.
students 20 years ago
Yeah.
that they're still using the material and
Yeah.
still and they still have targets for growth
Yes.
after all that time. That's
Yeah.
very satisfying.
I found it quite so. Quite so.
Now, what so one thing we've identified that were problems we were trying to address was um, the notion of being practical, behavioral, specific, so people could take action. People could diagnose and they could take action. Um, what, in your mind, when we were developing this, were the challenges that we were trying to address?
It seemed what some we've mentioned,
Mhm.
specificity and the behavioral, orientation. It seemed to me we have spent and right up until
Mm.
present, a lot of attention to how do we make this applicable, well, A, to changing situations in the world, So one of my memories from teaching was the 2008 recession,
Mhm.
and suddenly, one domain, in those days it was relational, became preeminent in every course. How do I get them to trust me? I've just laid off half of the workforce. How do I get the rest to trust me?
Mm.
Um, and then later, the challenge of impressing on people the importance of what we call contextual leadership. Again, because these are people think I need to be a better leader. Sometimes they don't think, wow, right now I need to be this kind of a leader,
Mhm.
or I need to find my version of relational leadership or my version of contextual leadership. So I think that was a big challenge.
Mhm.
I think a challenge that we faced along the way was how do we globalize this? How do we apply it to different target leadership and followership populations?
Mhm.
Uh, and uh, and I think how do we translate it as time goes by?
Yeah, so 2 your ideas there gave me 2 thoughts. One was, let me start with the second
Yeah.
one about the globalization, is one of the things I experienced, I suspect you did too, is when we taught this, we would start with personal leadership and then go to relational and then go to contextual.
Right.
So we start with the individual, then the dyadic relationship, and then the broader community circumstance. What I found in societies that are less individualistic, that you needed to start with contextual and then work toward the individual. Whereas if you started in, say, American or other Western individualistic societies, starting with personal made perfect sense to start by saying, well, as a leader, they need to know about you. Whereas in more collectivistic societies, ranging from China to New Zealand to Sweden, you would have to when you started with the personal, they'd go, "Yeah, that makes sense, but I don't quite." And when you got to contextual, it was
Yeah.
all of a sudden, "Oh, yeah,
Yes.
now I can put it all
Yes.
together." So I started flipping it around
Yeah.
when I would go to those circumstances, but it could relate.
Yes.
And that was the other thing that when people started looking at personal, they might say, "Oh, is this just a US-centric
Mhm.
leadership model?"
Mhm.
But every country I've worked in with this, they see the framework as very applicable, but how you translate that into individual behaviors and the style you use for those behaviors has to be adapted to the cultural circumstance that you're in. But you can do that with the framework, which is one of the nice things about the framework.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was my experience as well, that was that you had to think both about the framing of the model, um,
Mhm.
you know, and you had to think about the enactment of behaviors.
Yeah.
So, both teaching overseas, and I taught it a fair amount in New Zealand, um, uh, and teaching a diverse student body as we sometimes have. The challenge was, all right, if let's take one that's close to my heart, which is, giving people, um, respect and
Mhm.
dignity and voice, and the idea of how do you do that? How do you do it was easy to know how you do that in an American
Mhm.
corporation, how you did it in a Japanese corporation,
Mhm.
or in a Filipino organization or in a Russian organization. How do you do that
Yeah.
in a way that's not foreign,
Mhm.
but still effective?
And doesn't undermine that. I remember in Southeast Asia working with some folks, and they said, and I remember in particular one individual who was the head of his company saying, "I really buy into this, but if I do some of the relational leadership behaviors, or if I explain too much in contextual leadership, they're going to view that as a lack of authority and
Right.
confidence. I've got to be very careful." He said, "I'm going to take at least a year, maybe 2 years, to get them ready for me to exhibit those behaviors so they don't see it as leadership weakness."
Right.
And I heard from him a couple of years later, and he said, "Thumbs up, it worked, but
Wonderful.
it took me 18 months to get them ready for that, and now I'm doing it, and it's working much better than it did before. But if I had done it too quickly, it would have been
Mhm.
culturally inappropriate,
Mhm.
and it would have been misunderstood."
Mhm. Mhm. And I think we've come in our teaching,
Mm.
and in our writing to pay more attention
Yeah.
to that, those sorts of phenomena. I think one thing that's helped us, as you said, is that fundamentally the model has proved sound in
Yeah.
all of these environments. There's a there's some work that you and I did with some folks when I was on sabbatical in New Zealand about quick leadership, for
Yeah.
example, and the impact of showing shared values and showing self-sacrifice and showing the appropriate version of fair treatment,
Mhm.
as a way to get the door open for people to regard your leadership. Um, and those enacting those behaviors, how do you enact self-sacrifice or showing shared values or fairness, were things that were vastly different even in the samples we looked at in
Oh,
that
yeah.
study. They were, between young leaders in some of them, some of them European descent, some of them Maori descent in New Zealand, or our students that had been
Mhm.
in one of your classes in the States at that time. They were different, but if you could enact the behavior, if you could get the idea inside the follower's head,
Mhm.
the effect was the same.
Well, and the leader, I mean, one line I use all the time with them is, "We're not asking them to be naive.
Right.
This has to be practical, and you've got to take the circumstances into account." So if you're a very young leader, how you might approach things and the vulnerabilities you show might be quite different from a seasoned, very successful leader where everybody knows they know what they're doing, and how you approach it is a little bit different.
Yeah.
And but the framework can be adapted to those different kinds of
Well, I think,
circumstances.
and I think along with that, one thing that it's pushed us to do is to teach the necessity of adapting the framework, of
Yeah.
adapting to the local context.
Yeah.
And you know, in our more recent courses, we spend so much time on people thinking through their cultural and organizational context and thinking about what works and talking with coaches or with those they lead about how their actions are being perceived. It as I look at for me, the evolution of how I've taught the
Mhm.
the the model over the years, that's the thing that's grown the most, is to say, I can tell you where you need to get to, but we need to work together
Mhm.
to get the idea of how you enact
Yeah.
these behaviors.
And helping people in especially we've been lucky that a lot of the programs we've offered, especially open enrollment or degree programs, you get people from very different backgrounds and organizational circumstances. They can learn from
Yeah.
each other. Oh, your culture does it this way.
Yes.
I never thought of doing it that way. Let me
Exactly.
adopt that. Um, but you might not be able to take, say, a gentle New Zealander kind of approach if you're working on Wall Street
Yeah.
in a very aggressive financial organization.
Right.
Again, you've got to adjust, but you can learn a lesson and say, that's a target. I'd like to
Yeah.
get to that.
Yeah.
I just can't do it
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit um, because you mentioned the 2008
Yeah.
recession and the challenges that raised. Um, both when we created this and even if you look at today, what do you see as the sort of timeless challenges that this addresses? And what are the things that maybe have evolved or changed and have emerged more recently?
So my view,
Mhm.
the timeless elements are the fundamental psychology and sociology of leadership.
Mhm.
And I think one thing that struck me as I moved from just being a fairness researcher to being a leadership researcher is the idea of the ubiquity of leadership in human society.
Mhm.
You know, that I've come to believe that we evolved leadership and followership as one of the most fundamental forms of organization. Um,
Mhm.
in part because you see it in other social mammals. You know, you see it in in other contexts. Um, the way humans do that at a fundamental level, I think, it is fairly universal, and we have often we talk about in our course the follower's dilemma. You know, how do I decide who I'm going to follow? If I follow somebody, it could be better for all of us, but if I follow somebody, I could be exploited.
Mhm.
And how so much of leadership is about that, about
Mhm.
resolving those issues. That to me is the timeless bit. The parts that have changed, I think, um, are two. One is the impact of events on which aspects of leadership become most important. So I mentioned the relational thing,
Mhm.
you know, during the recession because everybody was afraid and how can I trust you? And of course, we know that trust is the effect of relational leadership. So, you know, again and again, I'd say you have to show them that you understand them. You have to show them that you respect them, you know, that you're
Mhm.
going to be fair to them. Um, and that can happen on that can happen on not only on these huge events like a world recession,
Mhm.
but it can also happen, I think, in day-to-day events in organizations or in groups. What do they need right now? You
Mhm.
know? Um,
Can I
yeah,
hop
sure.
in there? Because I think it also applies our approach to leadership is not top-down
Right.
hierarchical. It's about anybody or any group you wanna influence,
Right.
you're trying to lead them,
Right.
and that can be your peers, that could be leading up
Yeah.
toward your boss or leading to
Yeah.
clients of the organization, and how you do that, how do you show that you respect them? How do you show you respect your patients if you're a physician?
Right.
How do you show if you're in sales
Yeah.
that you really not only understand the need of a customer you're trying to sell to, but you respect them, you care about their desired outcomes. All of that is a way of building
Right.
trust, and that they're making themselves vulnerable to you if they let you influence them.
Precisely. Yeah.
That it becomes this 360
Precisely.
kind of
And
operation.
with the choice of or the care to avoid vicious circles and
Yes.
engender virtuous cycles, that will improve.
And by the way,
Yeah.
I think that is an insight we arrived at that people find especially illuminating. The notion that if I'm leading you, I'm gonna be way better if you're also leading me.
Exactly.
And that cycle, that
Yeah.
positive cycle
Yeah.
means it's not hierarchical.
Right.
Doesn't matter if you're my boss or I'm your boss or if we're peers. If one of us is having trouble with the other, probably both of us are partly responsible for
Right.
not leading
Right.
well.
Right. I agree completely. The other development, I think, um, it was really there when we started because the world was already pretty connected
Mhm.
in the early 2000s when we started putting it together. But um, but the challenges of remote leadership,
Mhm.
and again, the pandemic made that especially acute. But even this year, the most recent leadership program I taught in, it was clear that people are leading people they don't see.
Yeah.
They don't see every day. And the challenge there, I think, is to make them sufficiently self-aware,
Mhm.
sufficiently careful to think, I can't just assume they know what I'm transmitting.
Mm.
They don't necessarily know that I'm showing concern rather than monitoring, and how exactly I used to talk, and I'm sure you did too, when we would do, distance leadership things about how do you push all of this through a wire, through a satellite signal or whatever it
Yeah.
is these days.
But I did do that, but I learned it from you.
Well,
It's a lot of that is in terms of the notion that it is true that when you've got narrower bandwidth for communication,
mhm.
that it's more difficult in
Yeah.
some ways.
Right.
You can't use that as an excuse.
No.
You still have to
No.
do all of these things that are in
Right.
the 6 domains
Right.
framework. And in fact, if you think about it well, this is something
Yeah.
that we at Duke developed this
Yeah.
notion of place and space,
Exactly.
that if you think about it well, some of that mediated communication makes things easier, not harder.
Indeed. Yes.
So I can make sure if we're both looking at
Yeah.
the same screen and it's
Yeah.
mediated, that I can be sure you're looking at me because of
Yes.
where you're looking, and you
Yes.
can be sure I'm looking at you.
Yep.
Whereas if we're in a room with a whole group of people,
Yeah.
it's very hard
It
to tell.
Yes. Yes. And to be you mentioned bandwidth, to use bandwidth instead of being used by it,
Yeah.
to say, "Oh my god, this is a problem where I have to be there. I have to go do this face to face, or I have to pick up a telephone and use voice rather than text."
And this is an interesting place where I think some generational
Yeah.
things come in that I don't remember whether you ever raised this example too, but I use it a lot of people who say, "Well, I communicated with this person, but I haven't heard back."
Yeah.
And you have to say, "They're in the next office.
Yeah.
Why don't you get up and poke your head in their
Yeah.
door and say, 'I sent you an
Yeah.
email. I know you're
Yeah.
busy.'"
Yeah.
But they won't think of moving from an email to a telephone call to actually going
Right.
to see the person. And sometimes that means getting on a plane.
Sometimes it does.
But
Sometimes it does.
but recognizing that there are ways of signaling importance that are very important.
And I think being conscious of that,
Being conscious.
not just making it convenience,
Yeah.
letting the convenience dictate, but to say, I have to think, and we would talk about if you have conflicts, you need wider bandwidth than if you don't.
Yeah.
If you're coming up, we often teach change.
Mhm.
And if a change is coming and you're preparing people for that, it helps to build up your trust in advance. And sometimes that means accelerating your contact with them,
Yeah.
expanding your contact with them.
You
So I think
you would
yeah.
talk about building up your
Yeah.
bank account so
Exactly.
you can withdraw from the
Exactly.
bank account when you need to.
Exactly.
And during crises or times of change, you need to do that. And with limited bandwidth, this is why some of the research showed that if you've had face-to-face contact with people first, mediated communication can actually work quite well.
Yeah.
And, now I've had this where I've had students who have said that when they see emails from me after a class, they can hear my voice as they're reading the email. Well, that means they're also getting the inflection that you don't get in the email, but you would if you've had that prior, deeper contact. And especially if you're going to go through traumatic change, it's important to build that reservoir.
Absolutely. And to kind of build off of that as well, I think early on, one of the things that we decided about leadership was that it was fundamentally personal.
Yeah.
It was different from authority or management in that it's fundamentally personal. Even in cultures that are collective, we need you need a persona.
Yeah.
And I think that again in remote leadership, in distance leadership, the challenge is to put your persona across, and the challenge. I mean, the challenge quite often is to say, "Oh, we'll just do business. We'll just do the business bit." So, I think a lot of our, even in our teaching of leadership, a lot of the challenge was to make it more personal. And I know you and I both in teaching quite deliberately use stories about ourselves, not that we were grand in anything. We often told self-effacing stories about ourselves in order to become more human. As try and set a model.
And also, obviously, given our limitations, if we could do it, anybody could do it, right?
Exactly.
So one thing, I want to bring this to a current challenge for leaders that illustrates it's a different kind of channel limitation, which is we're now in a very polarized world. And so it may be that it's not that someone's halfway around the world, but they might as well be halfway around the world because they're in the polarized group on the opposite end of an issue from us. We never interact with that group. They never interact with us, but we have to bridge that polarization. And if you're leading, they may think you're associated with one pole or another when you're actually trying to bridge. Or you may be associated with one pole and you're trying to bring other people in. How do you see the framework helping people lead? And by that, I don't only mean in top leadership positions, lead others in a polarized world, especially across the polarized divides.
I guess I see two ways to do it. And if I were to describe them in terms of our model, there's a relational way and there's a contextual way. The relational way, I have a social psych colleague, Kees van den Bos in the Netherlands, who's done a lot of work on what makes people become extreme and radical, and what can bring them back. And he would say, you have to listen to them, even if you don't agree with them. You have to listen to them, and it's not about arguing; it's about getting their perspective on things, and then you can start the conversation. And I used to talk in class when I would talk about this as example. An example I would give is, you and I both served as head of department at various times, and of course in academia you have colleagues who you've butted heads with them for 20 years, right? And how do you get them on board? And the recommendation I would always make is for the participants in a similar situation to go and say, George, I'm the leader of this group right now, and we don't agree, but I need to know what you think. So talk to me about it. And I'm not going to argue with you. I just want to hear what you have to say. And so I think that's one technique, is to start the conversation going on their terms, and then say, I don't agree with you on everything, of course, but it's important for me to know what you think, and to start treating them. To me, the real challenge in relational is in what we call relational leadership is to really make people feel like people, not units, not just another box in your organizational design. and that kind of listening will do that. The contextual approach, I think.
Wait, can I comment on that
sure.
one for a moment first? That one of the things I often raise in terms of this is, have you ever said about another party, I just don't understand how they can see it that way,
Yeah.
or I don't understand how they think?
Yeah,
Well, then they're not going to trust you
that's right.
because you actually don't understand. And have you tried to understand?
Right.
And now, if you can reflect back to them in words that they would say actually reflect their approach,
Right.
it's not judging, it's just reflecting it, that you show you respect the point of view, even if you strongly disagree with it.
Right.
All of a sudden you've opened door. And more recently, some research on polarization has shown that if you start out wanting to argue and prove yourself right, you're going to lose.
Yep.
If you start with that, a certain percentage of the time, the other person can come around because you can then say, I get it, and I've shown you I understand why you think that way. Let me tell you what makes me think differently. That sometimes they will say, I never thought about it that way. That makes sense.
Precisely.
Now, a lot of times they won't, and that's okay because we can agree to disagree and still collaborate if we understand and respect each other.
Well, right. I mean, to just kind of elaborate, really just repeat what you're saying in essence, how can you expect them to listen to you if you haven't modeled listening to them?
Right.
So I think that's one approach. The
And
other,
then you were going to contextual.
going to contextual, and the contextual is all about seeing us as a group, seeing us as a unit, seeing us as a social entity, and there. The part, and this needn't be contradictory to the other approach. It can be in addition to the other approach. There, the message should be, well, yes, we don't agree on these things, but we share the goal of having this organization succeed or this enterprise succeed. How can we stop looking at how we're different and start looking at how we each contribute to this success?
But also the but not yes but yes and. What I would add to that is, but we do have differences, and the structure and the procedures we use reflect some of those differences. And the differences may not be because we disagree, but because we're solving different problems.
Well, we're different professions.
We're different
disciplines.
professions, and we're supposed to be bringing different parts of it together. And part of leadership is helping people feel connected to each other, not in spite of their differences, but in part because of their differences.
Indeed.
That makes life much richer.
Indeed.
Now, we're starting to get to the end, and what I want to make sure we also address is a very current issue of leadership in an AI world. How do you see the challenges of AI and the opportunities presented by AI for leadership as we think about it?
It's quite interesting to me. One of the interesting things about living at the time we do as scholars is you get to see who's referencing you. And more for the fairness stuff than for the leadership stuff yet. I see a lot of references to studies about how to make autonomous decision-making appear fairer. So I think that there is the challenge of how do you reassure people that how do you resolve this follower's dilemma in the context of decision making that not say all done by AI, but assisted by AI or involving AI. And I think we would say part of the answer is to see if the algorithms can begin to include some of the considerations that we and can both include and display some of the considerations that we say are important for leaders.
Yeah, the way I would extend that just a little bit is if you look at the foundation of our model, where you're trying to build credibility, trust, and a sense of community, those who are developing and deploying AI models, do we believe the model is competent? Does it actually know, is it hallucinating or does it know what it's talking about? Number one. Number two, is it displaying that it understands what we're trying to do and what we're trying to get at?
Yes.
Does it respect that?
Yes.
And then the third one is it transparent enough
Yeah.
in how it decides what it does, what information it chooses and
Right.
doesn't,
Right.
so that we feel like, okay, it it knows what it's
Right.
doing, it gets us, and it actually is approaching it with a structure that makes
Right.
sense.
So to hark back to a point we were talking about before about divisions and differences, w I taught on the basis of a lot of social psych of social identity in groups. Wherever there's a divide in a group, wherever there's a distinction, there's a potential for distrust.
Mhm.
And it's hard to think of a greater distinction between human and machine. So the challenge there is much like the challenge when you're leading someone from a different culture or a different race or a different gender. It's to say, I need to understand you and where you're coming from, and you need to understand me, and we need to reach some middle ground on this.
And there is a danger in that, and then I have one quick question, and then
Yeah.
we've gotta stop, is the danger in that is think about the AI models that are just basically echoing back to someone what they think they wanna
Yes.
hear,
Yes.
and people become more and more extreme
Mhm.
as a result of that. That's kind of like as if I'm leading a group from a different culture, I mimic their I pretend I'm from their culture, and I use that to seduce them
Right.
and into my way of
Right.
thinking as opposed or to enforce their
Yep. Yep.
biases. And so that's one of the dangers of that cross-cultural
I
kind of
agree completely.
machine-human
To
divide.
me, this is so reminiscent of the discussions we had when we put that top domain
Yeah,
on the model
yeah,
about ethical leadership and demonstrating responsibility, and demonstrating impartiality.
yes. Yeah. Okay, so the last question that we'll try to address really quickly is for the future. If you're looking, we've talked about economic recessions,
Mhm.
we've talked about polarization, we've talked about pandemics, we've talked about new technology like AI. If you're thinking about what is the most important lesson or lessons from the six domains for leaders looking toward the future, what would that be?
I think I'd go back in a sense to fundamentals. I'd say, um, make sure that the the leadership concern of the moment doesn't
Mm,
doesn't 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 encourage you to look at only one domain rather than all of them, and be mindful that that you can't be a leader without followers. It's a two-way thing. You have to pay attention to whether you are in fact
mhm.
being followed, whether you are in fact making a connection.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to frame it, and the way I would build on that is who are you now, and how will you be the same or different in that future? Do you understand them now and how they might be the same or
Right.
different in that future?
Right.
And are you in a position to provide the contextual leadership, or if not, own up to that
Right.
and bring in the
Right.
others who can help frame it?
Precisely.
But again, if you're preparing people for the future, that foundation of leadership is the essential springboard
Yeah.
for getting you into the
Yes.
future.
Yes, I think, you're exactly right.
Yeah, well, not surprisingly, we
We're in
agree.
complete agreement. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really fun. And I look forward to having future opportunities
Yeah. Yeah.
in another couple of decades.
Okay. It's fun. Yeah. Thank you,
Thanks.
Sam.
Thank you for joining us for the Six Domains of Leadership podcast. If this episode sparked new thinking about your leadership, we invite you to take the next step. Explore our Six Domains of Leadership workshops, certification programs, executive coaching, and 360 leadership assessments at deltaleadership.com. And if you found value in today's conversation, share it, because leadership grows when it's shared. To learn more about our global concierge leadership programs, visit our website, connect with us on LinkedIn, and follow us on Facebook. Delta Leadership is where leaders from around the world come together to create meaningful, lasting change. And remember, better leaders create better organizations build better communities, and better communities shape better societies.